Thanks for being here. Yeah, FHIR Product Director. Yeah. So, what's in the future of FHIR? What should be in the future of FHIR? I feel as though we're really at an inflection point in our history. But what do I know? We haven't had the future yet, so... But we're certainly at a decision-making point. I published Release 5 a couple of months ago. We're all still alive, having done so. It's really hard to convey just how big a task it is to do that. And then after you spend weeks doing quality assurance, somebody goes, what about this? And you're like, bleh. In this case, composite search parameters, disaster. So where are we in our journey? How do we think about our journey? And how do we appreciate what we have without becoming comfortable and self-satisfied? How do we set an agenda without being too critical? But the future, I'm primarily going to talk about Release 6. And what is it? What are we aiming for? Let's start by telling you about the FHIR Manifesto. Those of you who've been with us from the beginning will remember that we used to present on this. I used to have this on my wall to remind me about this. It was, at the time, pretty groundbreaking, but it was a manifesto that the core group of us adopted back when we started working on FHIR. And so, our manifesto, focus on implementers. Notice that it does not say developers, it says implementers. This is a wider group than developers, but our focus was relentless on implementation. And compared to the past, that was a real break, and so we focused on implementation, and here we are. We said that we would target support for common scenarios rather than pursuing the corner cases and the difficult cases. That didn't mean that they went away, though. It didn't mean that people didn't have to cover them. It meant that we were happy to make the corner cases more difficult and with the benefit of making the common cases easier. But the corner cases, the long clinical tail of things that happen to real people, they don't go away. And we didn't think they'd gone away. We would set out to leverage as much as we could cross-industry web technologies. We said that we would require human readability as a base level of interoperability. And that still is controversial for some people. Still, some people go, oh, no, we don't agree with that. We know better, and then come back to us years later and go, maybe that wasn't so clever after all. We would make content freely available, and we would support multiple paradigms and architectures so that information could flow free, and we would demonstrate best practice governance. So how are we going with those things? How have we performed against our manifesto? I think that we have always focused on implementers, and we have built that as a core value that's really hard to reverse, and HL7 responded to that drive from us by creating an implementation division. And we have one of the leads of the implementation division here. Hand up, Diego. Thank you very much. And they're really taking that drive of focus on implementers and stepping that up. And that is inevitable and a good consequence of what we've done. We still have reasonably good target support for common scenarios. And so I will offer you a value set as a resource around that. There are some really weirdo extensions out there for value set to do some really difficult things that are perfectly valid things to do. But on whole, the original simple design for value set that I did has lasted the distance. Even though the original authors of the equivalent terminology specifications came to me and said, it's way too simple, you don't even understand what you're doing. But there's some other cases where the complexity has steadily permeated the specification and we haven't been able to hold it off. And I'll offer you plan definition as an example of a resource that is irredeemably complex. So when I look at a resource like plan definition and think about targeting support for common scenarios, I have to think, are there common scenarios we could simplify this to? I will leave that as an exercise for the reader or the listener. I'm not sure that there are. Sometimes complexity is just complexity. But I still think about that. I'm not the only one in the team that still thinks about that. Leverage cross-industry web technologies actually got harder as we got further and further ahead. Like in the beginning, we were playing catch-up, and it was really simple. What are other people doing? We'll do what other people are doing. But then we actually got at the point where nobody was doing what we were doing, and it got a lot harder. And in some ways, actually other people are coming to FHIR and saying, if you really get to the complexity of having a specification implemented by multiple servers in a complex industry, we're kind of the name of the game now in that space. And so it's become harder to leverage cross-industry web technologies, and now other people are leveraging us. That's certainly not, like a globally true statement, but it is starting to become true. Human readability, I at least think that the implementation guides we produce are human readable. Readable by some kinds of humans anyway. But better than we've had in the past. Still, working on that. Content freely available, we nailed that one. I'm really happy with the way we did that, the way that played out, and the consequences it's had. Huge deal for us, totally locked into that, really transformed industry's expectations around making content freely available. Supporting multiple paradigms and architectures, yeah, check that box. Best practice governance, that's an ongoing challenge every day to do that correct. So that's our manifesto. Feel free to make comment to us later, me or some of the other leaders, about how we're going with that, or should we modify that now that we're at this stage 10 years later. We're happy to get feedback on that. There's one other thing that's really important, which is Tuckman's stages of group development. I think about these just about every day, and in some ways the right way to describe my role is a social engineer, and I regularly use those words. And Tuckman's stages of group development came out of a research study in the 60s describing the dynamics of any group of people. This applies to a team, a business, a political party, a church, a scout organisation, HL7, the fire team, any particular committee in the fire team, fire community. It's about people. It says, the theory says that when you get a group of people together, the first phase is forming. The group is coming together and realising that they need to exist as a group. They choose to exist for a purpose. What is the purpose? What is the group? What is the scope of our purpose? And that's the first phase, the coming together. The second phase is called storming, where huge arguments rip through the group about why we're here, how we're going to do what we're doing, what are we actually doing, forming a view of who we are, having formed how we're going to operate. That moves into the norming phase. We start saying, actually, we want to operate efficiently. We want to achieve our goals as a group. We want to figure out how we do what we do. And so we're starting to set normal behaviours, policies, processes, culture. And that starts to settle. And then eventually the group moves into what is either called conforming or performing phase. It's figured out what it is, it's figured out how it does it, it's figured out its cultural norms, stops having the big arguments and just gets on with business. But at that point, it's now very hard to change things because everybody's agreed. We've had all the storms, we've figured out the norms, and now we're just going to do business. I prefer to call this the conforming phase because performing isn't something you can take for granted. but you can take the conforming part for granted. And then finally you can get to, sometimes, the adjourning phase where the group says, yeah, we're done. We've met our goals. There's no point continuing to exist. Other groups will always exist. And the thing is that this process dictates that as you get into the conforming phase, you get both efficient at what you were doing and fragile for external shocks to the grounds for forming. Now, I offer you political parties. You will notice political parties are particularly bound by this process, and you will notice if you look around the world that political parties are very slow to respond to external shocks because they're very deep in the conforming phase. And when they finally do respond with a great deal of pain, they over-respond. Right? Political parties, classic. We can talk about the Australian Liberal Party if you want. Deep in this, and this is an important process, and they're a great example. As leaders of a community, you pursue a strategy through this process, forming, storming, norming, and then you're in the conforming phase, and then you realise that the strategy you're pursuing isn't delivering on your goals. What do? Almost every organisation I've ever worked with has a little review and it says the strategy's great, but we're just not effective. And organisations can always say we could be more effective. Then they double down on the strategy and say we're going to pursue it harder. Now, sometimes efficiency is actually the issue, and that's the appropriate response, to pursue it harder. Other times, pursuing it harder is going to make things worse because the strategy is actually the problem. And as a leadership thing, wherever you lead a group of people in your life here or elsewhere, I think it's the single hardest decision to decide when it's time to change the strategy and go back to readdressing the formative grounds for the group. And like political parties typically have to go through that cycle and have their face rubbed in it twice before they realise that the strategy is the problem. Same happened to HL7 actually with Fresh Look Task Force, which led to the creation of FHIR. The Fresh Look Task Force said the strategy is not working and divided into two parts. We need to pursue the strategy harder, and FHIR, which said, strategy is the problem, let's do something different. And it was really controversial within HL7, and all the things you could predict from this unfolded. Now, why am I talking about this? Because we're really at an inflection point in the FHIR process where I think we need to change our behaviour. So we've stated that our probable goal for FHIR, for Release 6, probable, is that we want to make the core normative. What's normative and what's the core? So this is the resources page. Basically, most of the top 3 rows, I think, need to go normative in Release 6. And so that's what's in a typical patient summary, patient core, patient workflow, and a whole bunch of supporting materials that we maintain as internal reflection resources in FHIR. And what does normative mean? It means to me, we in the specification don't make breaking change such that previous implementations that were correct become incorrect. In a bi-directional exchange of information, it's kind of really difficult to actually achieve without simply not changing anything at all. And so it's hard to define and decide. But what we've realised is it's kind of actually happening by default. Where the community consulted, the committee will look at something and say, really, this is a suboptimal design or a suboptimal name. We could really have a clearer name or a slightly change scope and then reorganise the information in the resource, and it would be easier to work with. And the community goes, no, not going with that. We don't accept that change. We agree that it would be better, but we're deeply embedded and invested in our existing solution. Sometimes the community goes, no, we really believe in that change, do it. Other times 50-50, but sometimes the community is like, no. And increasingly it's no. We can publish changes and the community says no. And so what we recognised as we prepared and finalised Release 5 was increasingly the community was like, no. And so it kind of doesn't matter whether we think we could make it better, we can't make it better. It's becoming normative by default, don't break us anymore. And there's always been a tension from the very beginning between trying to find the right compromise by testing, real-world testing and iteration, and just accepting that sometimes perfect is the enemy of good. And so we're watching that play out in the community at the same time as those Tuckman stages of group development are happening and our personnel are rolling over. Because there are people in this room that I've worked with for years who adore the storming phase. That's what they get off on. That's what they're here for, the storm, the Greek arguments. It's fun. And there's other people in this room who I've worked with for years who really don't like that phase. We'll talk about that later. And there's other people who like all the phases, but there are definitely people who like particular phases, and we need to, I try to roll those people in and out so they're in a place of happiness for them. But as a community, how do we respond to that change dynamic as FHIR becomes increasingly important as a standard rather than a potential new standard? So that sort of drives our agenda around normative, and that is, first of all, we are not committed to this. What we've said is we're going to let Release 5 sit in the market. When people think about this, we're giving people a kind of a 6 months heads up that later this year we will do a formal survey of as many implementers as we can, seeking their opinion about our direction. And at the same time, we'll do other implementer feedback. I'm meeting regulators around the world. I'm not the only one. Seeking feedback, company implementers. I've asked a number of people here. We will continue to get feedback before we commit to a particular course of action later this year. But if we do, and it seems very hard for me as product director to think that we won't, if we do commit to a normative path for Release 6, we need to change our existing processes and culture so that we can succeed in getting to normative. Because when we laid out our culture in the norming phase of FHIR as a whole 7 to 8 years ago, we laid out a maturity model with a whole set of gates for getting to a raised maturity, and the industry's taken off ahead of that. So we have to go back and say, you know, that process, although that process suited us then, it's not a process that suits us now. There's still the principle of maturity, I totally believe in that, but we're going to adjust the gates and we're going to adjust the rules for the committee so that we can accelerate things. And yes, that has risks, totally has risks. But the converse risks become more real as we go on. So we have to go back and actually revisit some of our norms and change the way we think about FHIR. And we need to improve the definitions around breaking changes and make it clearer, the expectations for implementers. We've had a couple of sessions that have made the need for that clear. At some stage, this is an enormously long list of things to do, but we need to do that. We do need to decide which resources we made normative. We had a lot of discussion about this in New Orleans a few weeks ago, where we talked about with the committees which resources would be normative, and I made a list which was shorter than the list I just showed you. And I looked at it and I thought, it's a problem, because there's a bunch of resources here that if we don't take normative in Release 6, they have missed the boat, in fact. It'd be very difficult for them to actually make meaningful change afterwards. So they're not officially normative, but it's way too hard to change them, and we didn't do the prep work, and we basically got caught out. So there's a kind of a FOMO for me on some resources that they'll miss out, and we didn't take them normative, but it doesn't matter. They're effectively normative, so we better do the work. So I'm going to go back to the committees and say, totally understood your reasoning, but I think we need to rethink this one. So, and it'll be a painful discussion. And we will continue to have that discussion through this year. So I think more resources than we thought will go normative, if you follow my logic. If you don't, well, no doubt I will get questions about this later. And no doubt you'll come and talk to me about this later, and I want you to do that. But there are some resources that are absolutely, definitely never candidates for being done in Release 6. They are too early in the Tuckman cycle. They're still, the groups working with them are still norming. There's no way they're going to be ready. And then we will be carving out some parts of the specification and saying, no, they're just not candidates. They will continue to evolve. I am not going to tell you which they are, although you can guess on some of them, but it will definitely not everything be normative. Moving away from the normative question, what are the agendas? As a product director, R6 is actually starting to feel finished as a product scope. I don't know of any big agendas for FHIR Release 6. It's now like, finish what we're doing. We will finish with obligations and additional bindings. I spoke to them briefly, Lloyd spoke about them, and finish those up and get them in the core spec and be done with them. We will continue to work on our quality processes in our QA. That's a never-ending process that we can always get better on. We will invest more in version migration assistance. So it's certainly something we're stepping up each time, and I can see that we need to really step that up when it comes to Release 6. Not that I have any idea what that looks like, but we need to do that. And I know that we need to do something about on-ramps. I've been hearing this, and I've heard this particularly strongly here at this meeting, that although we didn't like complexity and we tried to keep complexity out of the spec, and that was in our manifesto, like I said, complexity still exists and it creeps into the specification all the time, and the breadth and the depth and the width of the specification is now really, really difficult to deal with. For newbies, particularly newbies without a lot of experience in healthcare. Someone told me yesterday that what they do with non-healthcare developers is they give them FHIR to read, and if they come back and go, I think I could do this, then they know that they're going to survive. And if they don't, then they know that they're doomed in healthcare because they're just not going to make the transition. I'm not sure that when we set out to keep FHIR simple, that was what we were looking for. We do need to weed out the people who won't make the transition. There's a particular ways you need to think in when you're developing for healthcare. But what I know we need on-ramps. The challenge for me is that everyone wants their own on-ramp, and we can't write an on-ramp for every user. So we need to filter, listen to our feedback, figure out what are the on-ramps that we can write that will hit the most people. And then if we can determine the common on-ramps that will deal with that, we can actually add them into the specification. Those of you who are really close to the specification will realise that the existing on-ramp material that we have, implementers, introduction and so forth, zero change between Release 4 and Release 5. It's going to change. On-ramps. And for instance, we had a meeting yesterday about one particular on-ramp that is actually both important and niche, which is validators. There's only 2 validators. We know we need more validators for more platforms. We need on-ramps for validator writers. Even though it's a super niche, it's actually important. But we'll need other on-ramps. Maybe we need an on-ramp for an experienced database developer who's never done REST and never done healthcare, because we certainly have lots of people coming to FHIR like that. So if you have ideas for what on-ramps could be, don't bring them to me because I can't. That'll be too big. Take them to Julep. I'll create an on-ramp channel, an on-ramp topic in the implementers. We're going to have a little bit of discussion about what would be typical on-ramps that we could write that would help people along. Otherwise, what's our agenda for the future of FHIR? Well, implementation. We're here for implementation. So we continue to support scaling the ecosystem internationally. I sat down and I counted all the countries I've heard of, personally, doing FHIR this morning, and I got to 86 countries. I'm sure that there's countries I don't know about that are implementing FHIR, but I know that if I had written this list At the start of the year, it would have been about 50 countries. And I know that partly that increase reflects my expanded exposure to some sub-projects, but I know that also reflects real growth as well. And it continues to grow and expand significantly, and there's a number of initiatives that we have that are making that happen, and it's our challenge to scale up. Someone's asked me this week, can we have more training in Africa? Well, I mean, Diego was just in Africa and I was just in Africa training. Well, we can't go there every second week. How do we scale that up? We have some ideas. It's not it's just an example of the kind of question that asks. So that's a challenge for us as to how to do that. We need to continue and improve the tools that support the ecosystem, validator, simplifier, terminology servers, sushi, code generators, publishing tools. Terminology servers is a particular bugbear of mine because a lot of implementers are like, I don't want a terminology server, I don't need a terminology server, it's a stupid idea. And it seems like a really stupid idea until you run into those problems. We deliberately pushed complexity to the profiling engines and the terminology servers. If you think you don't need a terminology server, I think you don't really understand healthcare. It's my personal perspective. But I do know that terminology servers and healthcare are basically tied together. Right? You didn't really have the concept of a terminology server outside healthcare. So, but for me, we need to keep pushing the view of the vision of terminology servers, more platforms, more everywhere. We need to grapple as a community with the IGN profile explosion. Now, in some ways, it's good and inevitable because there's a use case explosion, and so there's a profile explosion because people have their own use cases. And then I have other people come to me and go, oh, there's only really so many use cases, and the countries are needlessly varying from the use cases. I'm like, it sounds really good when you say it like that, but when you actually get down in the weeds, you'll find that actually there's a reason why they vary. Maybe they're not good reasons, but they're real reasons that we can't change. And so some people come to me or to the community and say, the mere fact that you have an explosion of profiles is a problem. But we have an explosion of use cases. The question is, do we have an unnecessary explosion of profiles? And that is a really hard question to answer. How do we get control of that and grapple with it and give people navigation aids through that explosion so they can, instead of saying, oh, hundreds of IGs and thousands of profiles, I'll just write my own. Right, that's what we need to get to that decision point and go, no, there's a better way. You really don't want to do that. And of course, those of you in the room who've written IGs know that there must be a better way than writing your own IG, right? We certainly need to improve out the testing in the conformance ecosystem. That's part of, in a sense, the tooling, but it's more than tooling. It's about processes and culture and business arrangements. HL7 will probably never take on conformance testing per se. We write and provide the validator, we write and provide the infrastructure, but the actual process, the business, the cost, I don't think we're going to take that on and compete with our partners who actually do that as a business. But we need to help them, we need to grow that fertile ecosystem. How? Who knows? Testing is a really hard problem. We certainly need more work on mapping and transformation to help move data in and out of FHIR. There's at least one implementer has put to me the fantasy that if everything's in FHIR, we never need to move data in and out of FHIR. That is not my fantasy. That's kind of like hell because we do everything and we've got enough going on as it is, right? So in any rational view of the future, any view of the future that keeps me alive, we don't do that. And all of us are busy moving data in and out of FHIR all over the place. And the more easily and the more effectively we can do that, the better off we all are. we have created the FHIR mapping language that has not solved that problem. It's a step, it's not a solution. I really want to get to the point where we have portable mappings that go beyond the mapping language and look for some more action there. I don't know if we can land that in release 6 or even if we can, I don't think we need to land it in release 6, but we need additional portable mappings and easier tooling and so forth so that we can solve those challenges around mapping and transformation. And finally, we need to work more with the regulators around the world in terms of building relationships and trust. In a sense, that's not really FHIR's problem, it's HL7's problem, but those are increasingly the same thing, and HL7 knows that some of the ways that we interact with regulators work really well in some countries and not in others, and we need to up our game and create more options, and we know that we're working on those things. So for me, that's what I see in our future, the future for FHIR. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions, and I left a fair bit of time for said questions.
All right, thank you, Grahame. Do we have any questions in the room?
Wonderful presentation, Grahame, really thought-provoking. I just wondered, one thing you haven't covered are potential threats to FHIR, or do you think that's too negative a perspective to consider those?
Well, I mean, I do consider them personally. I think, the most obvious threat to me is that we will get carried away with our own success and think that we're cleverer than we are and take on problems we shouldn't take on. And sometimes a temptation to continue pursuing our linear path might lead us in that direction. So certainly that's something I think about a lot. People used to ask me, what comes after FHIR? And I used to, when we started working on FHIR, you're going to laugh at this, but I thought of it as a 5-5-5 solution. 5 years that we would work it up until it was kind of like a published standard, normative standard. 5 years to normative. Then 5 years where we would, this is the way to do things, and then 5 years we phased out because we sort of finished and someone else had come up with something better. And I realised about 10 years into the process that it was more like 10-10-50, because it would be like 10 years while we got to normative. It's be probably 13, 14, 15 maybe, and then another sort of 10 years as we slow down the core spec, because really it's getting increasingly hard to do anything with it, and it's moved into late stage maintenance. But the real flaw in my thinking was that there would be something new. But what I learned as I've watched this community grow and FHIR become pervasive around the world and not replace version 2, a little bit, but not much, is that if you want to go to a community and say, hey, I've got a better way of doing things, it can't be 10% better or 20% better or even twice as good. It needs to be 10 times better before the community goes, actually, it's worth looking at. Because huge change cost. And so it's going to be 10 times better. And FHIR is 10 times better than the alternatives because of a number of things. But for me, the single biggest reason that we're 10 times better is because we built the community. You here and a lot of other people here, and we built that on social media. And it's the first social media-based community around a standard. And those of you who've been in standards long enough will recognise the fundamental difference between what we have with FHIR and the other standards that came before that weren't built on social media. I know how hard I had to work. I know how clever we had to be, how hard we all had to work. And I recognise that we've made some technical things I technically regret. technical mistakes, or I think we could have done a better job, and it's too late to change them now. And don't ask me, because I'm not going to go into those now, but you fix those and get some marginal improvements, but you're not going to get 10 times difference. Where you're going to get 10 times better from, and where you're going to get a community that can deliver on that, unless they invent some entirely new social media way of doing things. And so I've kind of concluded that it's really very unlikely that there'll be something to come along after FHIR that is like 10 times better, because I just cannot conceive of it. Now, maybe some of you here can, and you'll come and tell me about that, and I'll say, great, I have a retirement plan after all. But I have concluded that the answer to what comes after FHIR is not in the foreseeable future. And so then that's its own threat. I mean, there was a threat that someone else would come along, but then it's its own threat, which is that we have to be here for the duration and actually be wise. And then I guess other threats, maybe some of the existing communities and standards think that they should do what we're doing better than we're doing. It seems very unlikely that when they really confront the actual challenges that we deal with, that they can be that much better and they can get that much impetus. And so I'm not really worried about, and I don't spend much time thinking about any like threats in that sense. Like for me, our job is to do our things as well as we can and grow and support the community as well as we can, and not get into worrying too much about existential threats from outside. Then finally the threat that I really worry about is, if I'm right and really is FHIR that's going to go the distance, how have we made sure that we make everybody's health better and we haven't missed some group that we shouldn't have missed to make their health better? And so one of the things I'm really keen to do this in the next year or two is focus on Africa, because we have really had very little interaction with Africa. And really, like I discovered when I was in Africa last week, that a lot of healthcare in Africa is family focused. It's provided to the family, consented to by the family, not individually like here. So I actually sat down last night and went through the entire spec. I was doing this while listening to some presentation. Went through the entire spec saying, could the family be the focus of a care plan? Could the family be the focus of a nutrition provision? Could the family? And the answer is about 50-50 no and yes. It's not good enough. So I'm creating a whole bunch of tasks for the committees to go and say, yeah, these things can be done and happen to families rather than individuals to support healthcare in Africa. That is a kind of a threat that I worry about, right? Now, Africa's not particularly special. It's just been a hole for us. So, there you go.
Thank you. FHIR-based care in New Zealand is another great use case for that approach.
So please chase the tasks down. There's a whole pile of them, and add your support.
Good morning. Just to maybe continue on this topic, how use cases expand. You said they have been expanding all along. There is one use case that has been sort of in the scope from the beginning, but we haven't heard much about it, is veterinary domain. Do you see any activity using FHIR in veterinary domain? Or if they start implementing more of it, how would that impact the whole FHIR ecosystem?
So there's a few differences between veterinary health and human health. First is the practice of treating herds rather than individuals, and it just so happens that that's the same problem as the African problem about treating groups rather than individuals. So I'm happy that I went through that last night. I was thinking about that question last night. There's some differences in consent management, but actually those have been explicitly dealt with. They were in scope for the committee doing contract and consent and permissions. around the idea that you might be consenting on behalf of a herd or an animal that you own. And the PA committee did make what to me was a disappointing decision to move the breed and species and attributes to extensions in Release 4. I wasn't on board with that, but I'm not yet convinced it was a mistake, but I'm very concerned about it. More for the signalling reasons than the technical reasons. Nothing wrong with extensions, and the extensions are there and usable. But on the other hand, I mean, back when I was in the lab, I did veterinary testing, and we just treated them as humans with, other things. With, a flag on them that was implicit, not explicit. So from where I sit, other than the group thing, which I'm trying to be on top of, and we'll be reminding the committees about, I think we're good with veterinary medicine, but I'm concerned about the signalling, and it would be really good to get some known runs on the board. I've talked to some groups doing it, but I haven't got a flag to wave around saying, here it is done in practice.
Thank you. Thanks, that was very illuminating overall. Without getting into a whole nother session's worth of discussion on it, have you given more thought to how to resolve the tension between the stability we want in the core normative resources and the rapid iteration we need on new areas that we're exploring and things, and how to get those pieces published and into the hands of people to implement?
I've put some thought into it, but I'm not ready to say anything about that yet. It's a challenge that we've talked about in FMG, the management group, that we know about, that has a number of particular challenges to us. And that was kind of what 4B was supposed to be, and I was completely underwhelmed by how useful that was in practice. Maybe that was because we didn't really think that through process-wise internally. So we got work to do in that space. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Well, Grahame, in the next period, we'll probably see some of the megatrends in healthcare, aging population, too few people to treat us, and so on and so forth. How prepared are we for that? How would that affect our work? We want to be stable, but the world might change quite a bit.
So I think that there is a section in the documentation talking about megatrends. It's just tacked on I think we still have it. It's just certainly in Release 3, tacked on the bottom, talking about the big trends. And for me, the trends are ageing population, increased weird consequences of pollution as we have pollution for longer and longer, and particularly we're starting to now see the genetic effects of pollution, because we're now having secondary, children born to mothers who were born during a period of significant pollution, and that's when the eggs come from. And so it takes 70, 80 years to play out as a population challenge. And I think we'll start to see more of that. Although the latest data, for instance, on lead, maybe lead was overrated, for instance. But I think we'll see more and more of that. But to me, the biggest and more direct consequences of climate change, I mean, different countries are experiencing climate change differently, but in Australia, man, we're getting whacked. But I think that most of those were anticipated one way or another, and by far the biggest challenge for every healthcare system that I've heard of around the world, we're already living, and that is we can't get enough people. And everyone knows that's going to get worse. That trend is written in stone in every country, and not just in healthcare IT, but healthcare generally. And so it will become ever more urgent for healthcare systems to optimise what they do have to the max. And like recently Australia said, we need more nurses. We're going to go on a nursing recruitment drive. And New Zealand said, the fuck you are. No, you're not. We don't want to lose nurses. Right? We don't have enough people worldwide. We can't just grab them from elsewhere. So for me, that is the single mega trend. All the others are just, like added on top of, we don't have enough workers. And so I think that health IT will be in the middle of that. Every government I've talked to, every powwow blue sky thing I've talked to has said, that's our number one problem, and our number one solution that we have thought of for that is make it more efficient. It's not hard to get to that conclusion, and so there you go. And have we done that yet? Nah, we've totally failed at that yet. We've got a long way to go, and it's not a healthcare, it's not an IT problem, it's a management culture process change problem. And so, for instance, I was asking yesterday, should HL7 get into the business of having a legal committee that does legal interoperability as its focus rather than a technical IT committee, or should it be some other organisation? It'd be very difficult to make that international. But like, from where I sit, I deliberately set out when I started FHIR to like move IT out of the way, so that IT was no longer the problem. I haven't done that yet, but we've done what we can probably, and some of the things I talked about, and we're like, yeah, we're about as good as we can, but we're not the rate limiting step anymore. Increasingly, it's lawyers and liability and legal problems, challenges for actually fixing things. So maybe that's where the action should move to, and maybe HL7 should or shouldn't do those things. The other obvious mega trend is AI. And so HL7's looking right now and saying, what difference will AI make? Now, Josh is here, but Josh tells me that AI will make structured data less important, and particularly well-described structured data will be of less importance than we thought it was. Maybe. I think that if you pursue the hallucination ability of the generative AIs, it comes from poor quality input information. And as you chase down the long tail of hallucinations, which we'll certainly need to do for healthcare, then any use of generative AI in healthcare, we will increasingly go, we really need really high quality input. And not to get generative AI to the point where it's impressive, but to get generative AI to the point where it's reliable. I'm not sure about that, but that might play out either way. But what I'm sure will play out is that as people want to leverage AI, what they're going to need is vast amounts of data interoperability. Right? I can train an AI on general data, but I need to train the AI on your data, and for that I need interop. And I need, you can feed me a database, but the more you can feed me standard models that I'm used to, that I know how to train with, the more I can chase down that long tail of hallucination, I think. So, and then I'm going to feed back outputs from AI that are going to go into the record, going to be provenanced and traced and tracked, and we're going to have second opinions and third opinions and whole stacks of AIs voting with each other and against each other to decide what to do in a care plan. All that's going to be interop protocols, right? So it seems to me that the AI megatrend says access to data is critical, and access to standardized data is likely to be critical. If you disagree with my analysis, let me know. And obviously, I'm not sure about some of that, but I can't help thinking that data will become more valuable and the availability of data will become more critical.
Thank you all for being here. That's about all we'll have time for as far as questions, but thank you for sharing. Great.
No worries. Thank you all.
Yeah.